Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started here with the fourth and final of the workshops. Thank you all for being here. I know it's been, I'm sure, an interesting day so far, full of insights and information, which also means maybe brain capacity-wise a long day, but really excited to see all of you here in the room and also online joining us for this session. My name is Micah Gerard-Levin. I'm the Director of Community Impact for Liberty Global. We're an international telecom company headquartered here in Denver. I'm also on the B-Civic Summit Planning Committee and have been really excited to see all the work that has culminated in today's event. The conversations, the questions, the presentations from the speakers, I know has certainly left me inspired and re-energized. This work, especially some of the DE&I work that we're going to be talking about in this session, I know can feel exhausting, more so for others who have been more directly impacted than, of course, I have. But being an ally in this work, it can certainly feel exhausting at times, and I empathize with that for practitioners of this work. But thank you for joining this session, Pledges to Outcomes, Diversity and Inclusion Works. For context, after George Floyd's murder, many companies and civic organizations made public pledges to do better around diversity, equity, and inclusion. 2 years later, what has changed? How do we hold ourselves accountable? Many companies have made progress, while others' results have been slow, non-existent, difficult to communicate or measure. To make change, companies must understand the levers that impact diversity outcomes. In this session, will show us and our companies how to bridge the gap between what they say and what they do. I certainly know me and my company that I work for will benefit from this. So with us today is Jason Thompson, co-founder of CAPE Inclusion and also Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Western Governors University. Jason is a successful author and diversity officer who has developed award-winning diversity programs across many industries. Jason's book, Diversity and Inclusion Matters, is a handbook for all DE&I leaders, providing a clear blueprint for successful DE&I programs. Jason is the co-founder of CAPE Inclusion, and that is the basis for the CAPE method, which we'll be learning about today. Now, as a reminder, all the workshops are being recorded. You can definitely go back and watch this one again, as well as the other ones that you may have missed today. Any resources that are mentioned will be available after the summit on the event platform. And we will certainly have time, as we have all day, for Q&A after this session. For those of you who are joining us online, you can use the chat area if you have thoughts, suggestions, and ideas throughout. But if you do have questions, please make sure to put those in the Q&A section of the event. We'll make sure we have a chance to ask those in the room at the end of the session as well. And of course, don't forget, if you are on social, cover for me because I'm not. Tag B-Civic, share what you've learned from this session, inspire others who aren't here with us today to carry on and do this work. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jason Thompson.
Good afternoon. I have 157 slides to go through and all the notes to read out loud, so this is going to be great. Late in the afternoon, who doesn't want to do that? So, but I'm actually going to start with a question. So I like to play games, and hopefully I won't offend anybody, but we're going to ask a simple question, and there's no tricks here. Anybody know, how long does it take to walk from the back of the bus to the front? Anyone? Just blurt it out. There's no right or wrong. 20 seconds. Anyone else? Any other guesses? 5 seconds. All of you are completely wrong. The answer is 381 days. We often know this picture, don't we? But when we think about diversity and inclusion, what I often find in this space is people know it's important, but they don't know what they're supposed to do. I hear that all the time. Like, I get it. We talk about it all the time. We know diversity is important, but what am I supposed to do when I get back to my desk? That's the question most people can answer, and that's why most diversity programs stall out, is people just don't know what they're supposed to do. It makes sense, but I don't know what to do. So if you think historically, this is a boycott that worked because for 365 days, they avoided the bus, but they also had somebody's got to help me get to work. They worked together and put together a system to respond to this form of discrimination that was, directed towards African Americans, right? Everyone knew what they were supposed to do. And that's the thing I've been thinking about is how do we make this thing work when people don't know what they do? And there's history for this. There's ways to actually do this. So essentially, big ideas got to have, you got to have practical steps. And so diversity and inclusion obviously is a big idea. but nobody knows the practical steps. And so most of my work is about how do we create practical steps. And I think what you're going to find hopefully with me today is that I am overly practical to the point of almost boredom. So we'll try to stay away from boredom, but you'll definitely get practical today. This is really, to me, the fundamental principle that we should be talking about is what could we achieve as organizations if every leader, manager, and employee knew what was expected of them in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I find is most people can't answer a question. So what we're going to do is start laying out, how do we answer this question? What are the levers we can control? So today, these are the three things we're going to talk about. How do we understand the diversity levers? What are the metrics? Like, we hear metrics all the time, but actually I don't think most people actually know how they work. The second thing is, how do we create a program that looks like your company? We're going to talk about that pretty quick. And that's actually a simple thing most people don't think about. And it doesn't mean we're not diverse, so I'm going to have a diversity program that's not diverse. It means, how do we message to our employees what we are in our culture as an organization? And I'll show you how I did that as well. And then lastly, what is the CAPE method that I invented that we use to do diversity? All of these are super practical. This slide, I want to apologize in advance. This is where I tell you how amazing I really am. And at every point, I'm amazing. So I've actually started diversity programs in 4 different industries from scratch. And if anybody's ever started a diversity program, you know what happens, right? They give you a desk, a small budget, and say, good luck. That's it. That happened to me 4 times. And through that process, I've learned a lot of lessons. And as a result, I wrote a book. I was actually approached because I was getting tons of calls from people like, hey, I know you've done this before. Can you help me? And I built a diversity program for the U.S. Olympic Committee, which was super complicated because within the U.S., we're the only nonprofit Olympic team. And every single sport that you see on TV is an independent nonprofit. So that's why you have USA Basketball, USA Volleyball. And I was tasked with, how are we going to measure this thing? What are the metrics? And so I was able to figure that out. And in 2017, a magazine rated the work I did as the #1 innovation in diversity. And basically what I did was figured out diversity is not what you do, it's the outcome of managing the right metrics. Most people start with diversity. As a result, the program starts to fall apart and they start to struggle. So what does that mean? It means you got to be intentional. Diversity programs have to be intentional. And this is the part I think most people struggle with is, yeah, we get that, Jason. This is all big picture stuff. You still haven't answered the question. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So the first thing I always tell people is you should probably pull out what are the mission and vision statements. So as I mentioned, I'm the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Western Governors University. And I realized right away that on day one, if people can't answer a simple question, they don't know what to do. And what I mean by that is people will probably say, well, why are we doing diversity at Western Governors University? And my answer is because we're endeavoring to be the world's most inclusive university. Now, I know the same thing you know. You probably never heard of Western Governors, so you probably know we're not the most inclusive university in the world, right? That's why the key word here is endeavoring, right? We're working to be the most inclusive. Now, how does that connect the dots here? So if you look, you can see at WGU, one of our mission is to change lives for the better by creating pathways to opportunity. Well, how can you change pathways to opportunities if you're not being inclusive? The vision statement, we want to be the most student-centric university. You can't be student-centric if you're not inclusive. So you can see how I'm connecting the dots to people. Well, as you know, we're trying to be student-centric. So we have to endeavor to be the world's most inclusive. That's the only way we achieve that. So hopefully people can start to connect. Okay, this starts to make sense to me. Even on day one, we can tell people this is what we're endeavoring to do, to be the world's most inclusive university. I may not understand the details, but I get the general idea, right? And so when I worked at Techstars, I don't know if you heard of Techstars out of Boulder, there it was Techstars Includes. It was easy on day one. We move fast, we launch companies, we include. I get it, like any employee could get that. So hopefully you can see, number one, you should sit down with all the mission, vision statements, cultural beliefs, whatever you use, and start thinking about, can I just create a simple statement that helps people understand the question? Now, the next step is, okay, what do I do with leaders? How do I help my leaders? Well, the first thing we need to do is understand what are we tasked with? What's the challenge here? So this is another question. Anybody know Jackie Robinson? Heard of Jackie Robinson? Okay, he integrated baseball. Now, I apologize in advance. You'll see that I'm a sports fan. Now, the thing that you might not know is the World Series is currently taking place. I'm not even actually watching the World Series this year, but there's something very significant happening in this year's World Series. Anybody know what that is? Right, this is the first time since, I think, 3 years after Jackie Robinson, so that would have been, what, 1950? This is the first time since like 1950 that we've had a World Series where there is no US-born African-American on either team. Think about that. This is what diversity looks like for Major League Baseball. Obviously, they started at 0. In the 80s, they hit a peak of about 20%. Now they're down to about 6. World Series is down to 0. This was, I would argue, is probably one of the first diversity programs, right? Integrating the sport. But what happened is no one's watching. No one's watching the metrics. No one knew what was expected of them. What are we supposed to be watching? How do we measure this thing? And what I tell people is, the thing you need is a process. This is the process. This is what CAPE stands for. It's an acronym. Number one, you need to collect the data. This is what most people don't understand but think they do. So for example, I had a colleague who works in diversity and they said, I got a job as a chief diversity officer, and they had a diversity committee when I got here. They decided to work on recruitment. So I just they already got a plan. I just went with it. And my response was, how do you know you have a recruitment problem? He said, I don't know. I said, well, you should collect the data to find out, because what you need to know is this. Is the issue people aren't applying for jobs, or is it they're not being selected? So they're applying for the jobs, they're not being selected. You have to separate that data, because no one applying is a recruitment issue, which lives in HR. No one being selected is a hiring issue, which lives with each hiring manager. If hiring managers are being held accountable, that's the only thing you can hold them to is you're presented with women and people of color, but you never hired them. That means they need unconscious bias training. That's not recruitment. So you can't task them with recruitment, and that's what typically is done in diversity. We haven't separated the data. We don't know how to organize it. And so as a result, we create plans that you can't execute and that people are really frustrated with, is because we got this plan that's not working. That's why it doesn't work. You haven't collected the data, so you don't know where you started. You haven't organized it in a way to execute on it. So it sounds overly simple, but you'd be surprised how many times I'm presented with this dilemma with most organizations. They don't actually know what the problem is, all right? The next piece is you got to analyze it, which we talked about, and then you build a plan. Because then I can build a plan that says, you know what, we didn't have a recruitment issue, we have selection bias. That means managers also know why we're doing unconscious bias training. Now it makes sense. Now I know why in the room. I'm not hiring any women. You'd be surprised how many organizations don't know that, and how many individual leaders go to diversity training. I don't do mandatory trainings, haven't done them in years. Why? Because people don't know why they're in the room. If they don't know why they're in the room, they're not gonna learn anything from it. They don't know what tool to take from it. So we have to start dividing, right? What are the tools? Why do you need that tool? That's when you create your plan and you execute. So the question now is, what are the metrics? This is actually what people can control. Who gets hired? Who gets promoted? Who leaves? Those are the levers that if you manage, the outcome is diversity. You don't actually start with diversity. It sounds overly simple, but you'd be surprised how many organizations have started with diversity. 2 years in, they're frustrated. Most people don't know the average diversity officer lasts 18 months. I would suggest this is the reason why. They're starting with diversity. They don't know what levers they can control and who controls them. Therefore, they can't get outcomes. So what you need is an equity table, not a diversity table. Most people have diversity tables. So what they'll do for you is what you see here in the upper left, which is what percentage of our leaders are women. Now for this fictitious organization, it's 14%. So if you're just using a diversity table, you'd say, well, that's super low, isn't it? Diversity is not working. What they don't understand is the lever is, did you have any opportunities to hire? If you've had no opportunities to hire, your leadership team's gonna look like this for several years in a row. And think about it, nobody wants high turnover. If you're in an organization that has really high turnover, something is seriously broken, especially amongst your leadership team. So if all you're using is the diversity table, you're gonna get stuck at 14 and think every year, beat ourselves up, we're failing. You gotta understand the levers. If you never had an opportunity to hire it, it would make sense that you would have 14% 2 years in a row, right? So that's why it's important to start putting all these things in the context and have an equity table. The question you should be asking yourself is, how are employees experiencing my organization? So if there are no opportunities to hire, what should we be looking at? Who gets promoted and who's leaving? Because you could have a revolving door. Well, we look very diverse. Again, if you look at the diversity table, you could come up with that. Oh, we're very diverse, we have gender diversity, but all the women are leaving at the same rate we hire them. You don't actually have equity. So again, that's the difference between a diversity table and an equity table, is you got to start lining these things out and knowing what metrics you actually can control, right? And then here's the other thing I find is this. And this is a challenge for most diversity officers. At the end of the day, true or false, if you're committed to diversity, I should see it in your leadership team. True or false? Anybody? Leadership teams should be diverse. Yes, that's true. So if I had 20% of my leaders were women, is this good, bad, or average? 20% of my leaders. Bad, probably, maybe good, average. Women make up 50% of the world. 20% would be awful low, wouldn't it? This is the thing that gets most people in trouble, that logic. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't be aspirational. I'm saying we should know what can actually be the outcome. The biggest challenge for diversity is unrealistic expectations. So I'll start breaking down these numbers. They're a little boring, but they'll make sense why it's important. So women make up technically right now 21% of corporate executives. So if your company's hovering around 20%, it's probably average. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't try to get to 50%. I'm just saying that's what average is. Most people don't even know what average is. We just make an assumption, well, 50% makes sense. It does. Women make up 50% of the world. But how do you get to 50%? That's the biggest challenge. So let's use this hypothetical situation. A lot of organizations might have 10 executives, right? Of your 10, you probably have 2 women and 1 person of color, and maybe 10% turnover. Now, the reason I start doing this math, even though it seems super boring, is because when I worked at the Olympics, the head of HR came to me and said, Jason, our goal is 30% diversity in 3 years. That's what we should do. I realized it was mathematically impossible. Why? They didn't have enough turnover. And that's the thing that measures this. So if you think about it, if you want to get from 20% to 50% gender diversity, and possibly from like 10% to 30% people of color, that sounds logical that you could do that. But the math doesn't work. Because if you think about it, to get from 20% to 50%, you got to have 30% turnover and 100% retention. It's mathematically impossible, right? Even get to from 10 to 30% people of color, you got the same problem, 100% retention, right? And then 100% of your hires have to be people of color. Most organizations cannot do that. It's mathematically impossible. So even though this math is overly simple, it happens at scale everywhere. This is the biggest challenge. And this is why most diversity officers don't make it. They don't understand the math. And organizations start setting goals that actually aren't achievable. So for example, just recently, I went to a presentation and they said, oh, here's our goal. We want to be at X percent. And I knew it was impossible. Why? They didn't have enough turnover. Nobody wants high turnover. And the hard part about leadership is that most people use the definition of, oh, if you're committed to diversity, your leadership team will be diverse. Leadership has the lowest amount of turnover. Why? Because it takes a long time to get a VP job. And if you get it, you ain't going nowhere. They don't leave. Now, because they don't leave, that's actually a good thing. Why? Because the CEO, her job is to keep good people. If she's keeping good people, we are working at opposite ends of what needs to happen because I'm tasked with making it more diverse. So if the CEO doesn't understand what the metrics are either, they're going to hold you accountable for something you can't even achieve. You can't get to 50%. And you'll see, I've seen this before, where CEOs are like, oh, we need to be at 50% gender diversity. Okay, well, who's leaving first? I need you to go around the organization and start asking men to leave. That's the only way we're going to get there, right? And you got to do it at a rate of 45%. And think about it, no one's going to do that. It can't be achieved. And so you have to set realistic expectations of what can be achieved at what pace. And it's not to say diversity isn't important. It's not to say we shouldn't try to get to 50%. It's more so to say, how do we hold each other accountable in a way that's fair and equitable, right? And so the real question, as I mentioned, oh, this is just to show what's average, okay? So even if we just said we have 20% women, we want to get to 30%, you got 10% over, you already know where the math is going, right? That's 100% retention, and 100% of the hires have to be women if that position becomes available. So what should you be tasked with? The strategy should be, what are we doing right now before we even need to hire to create a network where we can quickly find candidates? Most people work from panic mode. Their strategy is disproportionately on, oh, and someone left, let's panic and find somebody. And I'm going to talk about the myths we have there as well in the pipeline, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the first thing is, if you understand this data, then hopefully what it does is help you maximize where to put your resources. And many times people put their resources in things like, well, recruitment, when that's not the issue. It should be actually creating a network so you can find candidates. But the other thing is, how do we know what a realistic expectation is? And that's why this is an equity table. And what I have done is I take who's available in the market. So one of your constraints are, if you're an engineering company, you're probably not going to get to 50% gender equity because women don't make up 50% of engineers, right? So right then you should say, well, what is the market then? And then also at what level and by department? Because it might be one thing to say for the engineering department, we can't get to 50% gender equity, but you should be able to do that in marketing, right? So it doesn't drive the whole company. That's how each leader knows what they're being held accountable to. And if you use market availability, you can say to each leader, this is what we think the diversity would be normally for your department. And the other calculation we do is you see there's an asterisk on the top there, right? Women is 14%. The reason there's an asterisk there is we do another analysis. And that analysis is it statistically significant? The difference between 14 and 38. And in this case, it is. You're so far from average, something else is going on. Therefore, we think there happens to be bias, right? But I can't punish you for it. Why? Because you never had a chance to hire. But there is something I can hold you accountable to. Who's getting promoted? And guess what? You're promoting women at a rate that's higher than represented in the department. So I know they're experiencing inclusion and equity. A lot of times people say, oh, this is just diversity. No, no, no. That's how I know. Because I know who's getting promoted. Women should be promoted at a rate that's equivalent to the representation in the department. Therefore, I know it's fair. And then I do the calculation when one's lower than the other, I can say, it's a matter of fact, women are being promoted so low, I have to assume there's some form of bias, which is why I'm inviting you to our unconscious bias training. Because the first assumption is you didn't know you were doing it, right? That's how unconscious bias works. You didn't know. But now they can connect the dots. I'm being held accountable. I know what levers I control as a leader. I know why I go to training, right? You can see how we're connecting the dots, how you can get a diversity program that actually works. That's the biggest gap I see is most people don't know the levers, right? You could also say, wow, your department is super diverse. Great, but your turnover is so ridiculously high. It's too far from normal. Something else is going on here, right? Again, if you just look at diversity, you would think in some cases, oh, diversity is great, but there's levers. You got to know what the levers are. How do we measure the inclusion? That's what these tell us. So I'll stop boring you with the data and the CAPE process and just highlight a few other things that I think are important when it comes to diversity. One is diversity training. Diversity trainings don't work. I'm here to tell you that, right? And there's a reason why. And one of them is actually somewhat connected to this picture. Again, I apologize. I'm a sports fan, so there's a lot of sports analogies here. I apologize. But you probably, I'm actually dyslexic. That's how you know I don't have any notes. I'm dyslexic. So and every time I see this word, I can't pronounce it. I know it sounds weird, but that's how dyslexia works. His last name, can anybody just blurt that out? Because if I can't read it. Kaepernick, okay. I always can't remember Kaepernick. Okay, so Kaepernick, right? If I see it, it screws me up. I can't actually read it. I know it's weird, but remember the moment, right? He took a knee and he got a ton of pushback. A lot of people are like, you know what? Not a problem. We've got a black president. What's going on here? I don't get it. This is just, he's just self-absorbed. He doesn't get it. And I can see why people think it's over because of how we've presented issues in the past and how we do diversity training. They're typically mandatory, right? And so the reason I don't do mandatory trainings is because what they do is reaffirm that these are episodes, not that these are connected systematic events. And as a result, when people see this, they see it as an episode because they got the training, we're over it. Yeah, we knew this. Didn't we already deal with this problem? Right? And so as a result, if we only do things as a response, we can't see the systems. All right? One-time trainings imply that this is a one-time issue. You've been trained on it. We've moved beyond it. They don't see it as a system. Right? And also, the topic is complicated. Right? Systemic racism, systemic sexism, LGBTQ, you name it. These things are systems. Right? And many times people are like, oh, no, I'm not doing anything. So therefore, I'm a good person. These things don't exist. Right? So here's a couple examples of why we need to teach diversity different. Number one, Ruby Bridges. You've probably seen this iconic photo, 1960. She integrated a school, right? And they got her in the school with armed guards. Does anyone know how many times she had to go to school with armed guards? Now think about this for a minute too. Like we need to put this in context. You get up in the morning with your 6-year-old child and you drive to school. You kiss her and hand her to 3 armed guards who get her into class. The first day, they're so afraid for her, she never even got to the classroom. She sat with the principal all day. You know how many days they did this for? The entire school year. Often this is taught is, oh, this is the photo. It was terrible. And then we moved on. No. Can you imagine? You know what happened? At one point, she stops eating and is having nightmares. She gets them every day, and there are white people yelling and screaming at her and calling her horrible names. And guards have to protect her. Can you imagine how painful this must have been? I don't know how her parents found the strength to do that. But luckily they did, because that's why I'm standing here in this moment, is because for whatever reason, they sacrificed their 6-year-old child for me. And I do appreciate it. But we don't put that in context. And as a result, we think one-time training, oh, it was just this one moment, right? But it's connected. I started my career 1991. I've been doing diversity a long time. This is the training we did, Rodney King. 2020, I'm doing the same training. We have been presenting this as episodes, not connected events. So we have to create opportunities for people to understand the concept and then practice it, because that's how we learn. So my example being unconscious bias. We give you one training, we act like, oh, that'll last forever. You got 45 minutes of unconscious bias, you're good for the rest of your life. We don't do that with calculus, but we do that with diversity, so you can see why people struggle with it. So when they hear things like, oh, systemic sexism, oh no, that doesn't exist. I'm a good person, and they are good people. But this is how it would work. And like, for example, right now, bonuses, like many people are getting their bonuses, right? And we do our annual review. Bonuses are actually biased against women. Why is that? Well, think about this. One way you get a bonus is by going above and beyond. To go above and beyond, one of the ways we measure that is time, that you come in early and you stay late. Women disproportionately provide care for their children. Therefore, they're less apt to come in early and stay late, so they can't meet the criteria. Now, I, as a manager, I'm a good person. You don't come in early, stay late. You know what? Your husband can take care of the child. In theory, that's true, but that's not what happens in reality, is it? So systemically, that criteria disproportionately impacts women more than men, because historically, women are tasked with childcare. So it's not that men never take care of their children, right? I'm not assuming that. I'm just saying you have to put it in the context of the history of this country. So during COVID, what happened? Women continued to take care of their kids. Men did not. We know that. That's a system. That's how the system works. It doesn't make me a bad person, right? And in most cases, that's how people respond, right? Well, I didn't do it. Well, of course you didn't. But it doesn't mean you're not benefiting from it. It doesn't mean it doesn't disproportionately impact your sister or your mother or your daughter, but that's what happens, right? So you have to understand the context, because most people are like, I don't do anything. I'm not a bad person, right? Of course you're not. That's not the point. It's that the processes. And so if I teach you unconscious bias, you never get a chance to practice it. Therefore, you can't apply it. And what we're asking people to do is understand a bias, understand privilege, and apply it. And you can't do that in one training, right? Microaggression, right? That's a complicated thing. Here's my microaggression example. Sometimes people ask me, where are you from, Jason? I will say Wyoming. Now, that'll give you pause. Come on, black people, Wyoming, that's not supposed to happen, right? But I'll say, yeah, no, there's a military base, and that's enough. That's the end of the conversation. But for my friends who are Asian, they know where this is going. Where are you from? Oh, born and raised San Diego. No, where are you from? San Diego. No, where are you from, right? And then eventually they'll go, look, you just want to know, am I Korean or am I Chinese? You don't really want to know where I'm from. That's, it's a microaggression. And it seems like the question is simple. I'm not, but if you think about it in one context, it's not a microaggression, but in another it is. So it's complicated. How am I supposed to understand that? We never give people a chance to practice. Now, intuitively, I would say you understand this concept. Why? Because if I said to you right now, would you like to go on a date? You go, wow, that's aggressive. In the middle of your presentation, you're going to ask me on a date, Jason? Really? Right? But if I asked you 4 hours from now, 2 blocks down the street in a bar, you'd go, well, the answer's still no, but at least it's the right context, right? Think about that. It's complicated. Somebody had to teach you when you can ask for dates and when you're not supposed to, right? But you get a chance to practice it. You become a middle schooler, and weird things come up and you talk about it and someone helps you figure it out. Microaggressions, we never do that. We never create space. So what are diversity programs supposed to do? We got to create space for you to practice, and you can't do it in a one-time training, right? So what I have moved to is a theory of organizational change. I'm not selling the book, but everything I tell you today is actually in the book I wrote. So this theory is what I've moved to, because I realized diversity training isn't about mandatory attendance. It's about messaging that this is a priority for the organization. It has to be done with repetition. So you should tie your diversity program to organizational change. And I use ADKAR. There's tons of organizational change principles, but the one I've used is ADKAR. I'm not an ADKAR expert. But I realized if we just do diversity training every month and message it, it doesn't have to be mandatory. Why? Because the goal is to create awareness. That an employee would go, wow, we do this every month. They send me something. This must be important. If I want to be successful here, maybe I should align myself with this, which means I would then do what? I would get the desire to go. If you have the desire, you go and you get the knowledge. If I get the knowledge, I have the ability to apply it. And the reinforcement is the repetition so that I can practice the concepts. So now I can say, oh, now I can see when I do the annual review, well, I look at women and say, wow, they're really aggressive. but I call men direct. Now I see how I take the same behavior and apply it differently. This makes sense. Unconscious bias makes sense to me. Privilege makes sense to me because I've had a chance to practice it. And generally what I find is people come to me and they go, you know, Jason, diversity, I get it, but I don't know what to say. I'm afraid to say the wrong thing, right? And I can see why they'd feel that way. Why? They never get a chance to practice the concept. That's what you did in calculus, right? You go to first day, seems like everyone understands it except for you, so you don't ask a question. But if you keep going back to class, practice, you start getting the confidence about the skills. That's not what we've done with diversity. We give you one-time training and go, you're good for life. You're going to stop discriminating right now. Like it doesn't work that way. So that's why I moved to ADCAR and realized diversity training does not have to be mandatory. You've got to message this as a priority. Everything that's important to a company, they message on a regular basis. Diversity, equity, inclusion has to be in that same space. And so what we do is like 10, 15-minute sessions where people can come to a video. And a lot of them it's not even like, this is the microaggression 15-minute training. It's literally, we use a company called Seed and Spark. I have no investment in Seed and Spark, but it's basically a version of Netflix. But all the actors are LGBTQ, people of color, women. So it supports the arts, and there's 15-minute videos that they have. And then we ask people to ask some questions. Can you see microaggression? Can you see a form of privilege? Can you see bias? 3 simple questions, 15 minutes. The video is available 24 hours a day. There's no excuse not to participate. So my goal is remove barriers to participation. So there's no excuse, all right? We give them the leverage of what I control. Then I can know I have spaces where I can practice, all right? They can do it individually. We also have like a movie club. So you can come to the session and we talk about it as a group. We do both. So again, if you're an introvert like me, you might not want to go to the group, but you can still participate, right? So we try to be as inclusive as possible. You could use YouTube videos. You can send articles. It doesn't matter. All we're doing is creating a space for you to practice the content. That's what's missing. You don't need mandatory trainings. And you're always going to have people who aren't going to attend. That's the reality. And I don't blame them. Like, you know what? Okay, I don't always go to the accounting sessions that they hold. I don't know how to do travel all the time. You know what I mean? Like, we do our annual reviews. I don't know how to use the software. I have to look it up, right? You do annual reviews once a year. But I do know they're important because they always tell you got to do annual review, right? It's the same idea. We've got to use the same principles, the same things, and give you space to practice so a person can overcome saying, I don't know what to say. I'm afraid. Because that's normal. We got to say, look, it's normal to be uncomfortable, but you have to be present. That's another thing I tell people. I got all these things. I apologize. You do not have to be perfect, but you have to be present. That's actually one of the things we practice in our organization. The goal is not perfection. It is being present. It will be uncomfortable, but you just remain in the space. And if you think about it, in your whole life, you've always done that. Wherever you remain present, you learn, right? Now, there's some fundamental things with diversity that make it hard. Number one, when you go to Thanksgiving, you don't talk about politics, right? We know, we don't talk about politics. You don't talk about race. And if something makes you uncomfortable, you move away from it. What do we ask you to do? Politics, race, and move towards things that make you uncomfortable, right? We're violating all the fundamental principles. The only way to help people with that is repetition and practice. So that's what we do. That's the logic, right? So you'll find Jason is full of just all kind of like quick sayings and logic that you probably disagree with, which is good. But this is another one of my soapbox right here. I do not believe in developmental programs. So as a diversity program, you should not have developmental programs, right? They're a fundamental violation, and I'll tell you why. This is why I don't like them. So what they do is they assume people of color and women need to be fixed. So a lot of times what happens is you go, oh, we need to have a diverse leadership team. Let's create a developmental program for women and minorities, exclusively for them. And I'm like, no, that dynamic sets up, and I've done these before, so I'm guilty like everyone else. But that dynamic means you assume that they're broken, and that's the reason they're not in leadership positions, that something is wrong with them. So they got to be fixed. You don't promote people who are broken and need to be fixed. So if you set up that dynamic from the beginning, it starts to actually hold candidates back. Because one of the things people will say is, and this happened to me before, oh, we have a diversity program. Our VP job just opened. Oh, Cindy would be great. Has she finished the developmental program? Right? So she doesn't get the job because she hasn't finished it. While her white peers, they didn't have to go to the development program. They're considered right now. So it's held against you if you haven't completed it. It's held against you if you're in it, right? Because you haven't finished it, so I can't consider you for a leadership. So it's unfair. The other thing it does is it produces too many candidates. So that's the other thing I learned the hard way as a diversity officer. You get maybe Let's see, most organizations, maybe 10 VP jobs open a year, and that would be a lot for a very large company. But you probably produce 150 candidates who are all going to be very mad at you because guess what? They're not going to get the job. Over 90% of them can't get the job. You don't get 10 jobs and 150 candidates. And if you do that for 2 or 3 years, you now have what, 400 or 500 candidates for maybe 20 total jobs. And after a while, like, well, I had to do all this extra work that my peers didn't, and they got the job and I did. How's that fair? And they're right. So developmental programs are not a solution. They're fundamentally flawed, and they reflect a bias that somehow women and people of color are broken. They have to be put in a special program for leadership. So what do we do in lieu of that? Network programs. Why? Because I hire from my network. I don't hire from programs where people are broken and need to be fixed. Think about that. Right now, if I said, hey, I got a job. Do you know anybody? You go, oh, who's in my network? You don't go, who's in the developmental program? I need those people who are broken and need fixing. That's who I'm going to recommend. You wouldn't recommend those people. So if you think about it, we're now even more remote than we ever had been before. Like I tell people, I won't pass any of my colleagues in the hallway. We're not going to meet at the water cooler. So in lieu of that, what are we going to do? You have to create spaces for people to actually interact, but interact in a way that we are seen as peers, that I have potential, not as somebody who doesn't have potential. So it can't be a mentorship program, because in mentorship programs, it's based on the fact, or developmental programs that I'm here to fix you. Instead of, oh, these are my peers and I will probably hire you. You have a unique skill set. And we need to tell people the goal is to hire based on potential, not on whether or not I had the job before. Hiring on potential works, and I can prove it. How can I prove it? If you hire on potential and you are a sports fan, which is me, and I apologize, Super Bowl last year, right? 2 head coaches. Neither one of them had ever been in the developmental program, right? First time head coaches, straight to the Super Bowl. If we look at women and people of color, people with disabilities as people who have potential, we can show we can do this. Now, there's another thing we have to do too, which I have to call out. We also have to separate failure from race and gender. Because at the end of the day, the majority of head coaches who have failed in the football league have been white men. Now, I don't begrudge white men, but we don't connect their failure to their whiteness. They're allowed to fail. We have to give the same permission to the, guess what? You probably will hire some women who are going to fail. You're going to hire a person with disability who's going to fail. It has nothing to do with their disability. Failure actually happens. Sometimes you just made a bad hire. That's going to happen. So the reality is we have to separate those two things, because that happens all the time. And we feel that internally. Like the data shows, women only apply for jobs which they're 100% qualified for every single criteria. And men, give us 20%, we're in, right? We don't need to, but women know intuitively, because if I fail, you're going to hold against my gender, right? And many people of color have the same, like I feel the same pressure, right? You're the first chief diversity officer. If this goes poorly, they probably won't even do diversity anymore, right? So you feel that pressure, but we have to push back on that and tell people, look, failure is normal. It happens in the system all the time, right? And in fact, if we hold it against people, it prevents us from actually having this. If they were actually using data and said, what's the probability of a white man failing as a football coach? It's pretty high right now, right? Very high, but they don't do that, right? Because it has nothing to do with their whiteness, right? These two guys who never got the job. So the reality is we've got to separate those two things and call that out. Now, the good news, I'm done. So if there are any questions, I don't know how we're doing for time. I usually figure if we're late in the day, we need to go faster, but I can take a few questions, I guess. We have a few minutes. Or...
Yeah, we have about 20 minutes for time or for questions, and we have the microphone, so we'll use that so that everybody can hear online. I see a hand over here, and then I'll also check in and make sure we get to any questions that are online.
I really appreciate that last point about making sure we're hiring on potential. Kind of a nuance to that is often what I'll see is in roles like chief diversity officer or what have you, is not potential so much as sort of pigeonholing, oh, well, the person of color or the woman will do that, and they're not really either set up for success or don't have the skill set, right? And it's assumed that they can do the job because of their identity or one part of their experience. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I can. Thank you for helping me promote my book. That's exactly why I wrote the book. I was getting tons of calls where you'd be surprised how many calls I got. Matter of fact, I remember a vivid call of somebody who, she said, well, I'm LGBTQ and I'm chief legal counsel, so they figured I could do it. I don't have a clue what I'm gonna do. Can you help me? And in a way, I didn't blame her because it was a promotion. So yeah, but there wasn't a lot of books and things out there to help her actually achieve. But you're right, many times we do use this thing of, well, you're the most senior Black guy. I bet you could do this, right? And so, yeah, that shouldn't be the point either. It should be, actually, this is in line with where I want to go with my career. This is consistent where I see myself in the future. But it's hard to turn that down. I don't blame you. If you're at the director level and this VP job opens, I don't begrudge you. I'll take it. You know, that's your chance to get into that C-suite and that executive. So take it and buy my book. I mean, I'm not trying to lobby for it, but I do think it's like anything else. I think if opportunities and this is a way for us to get in the door, sometimes you got to take it, you know, and so I don't blame people for doing it.
Other questions?
I really like the topic about the development programs and not having that. I guess I hear a lot about, we have employee resource groups. I hear a lot of other companies talking about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh,
Just in general.
employee resource groups, I think, are good. And the reason I think they're good is it helps retention, because it's one of the things that okay, we're always tasked with this, right? We got to measure things that don't really have a number, right? They're not really measurable. But what they do is they create culture. Like, you need a space sometimes where you're like, am I losing my mind here? Is this really happening? I can't believe what was just said to me. And many times it's because I'm a person with disabilities, or because of my gender, or because of my race. And that's not complaining. That's actually how we deal with challenges. Like, we have to be able to say in some space, is this happening? I don't know. And then we can share and help people understand, oh, this is the culture of the organization. This is, you know, what you're experiencing is real. Like, many times we try to make people feel better by saying, oh, I don't think they meant it that way. That actually makes it worse, because it creates this issue of, is something wrong with my reality? There was that movie, which I can never remember the name of, where he's actually in a TV show and he doesn't know he's in the TV show. Truman, right? And if you think about it, it was hard on his psyche to look around and go, something here is not real, and everyone keeps telling you it is. It was easier for him when he was like, okay, now that I don't know I'm in a TV show, I can deal with it. It's the same idea. If I'm experiencing sexism and someone says, yeah, it's real, doesn't mean I'm going to give up on life. It just means, okay, I can calibrate this now. It's important for me to be able to vocalize that I'm experiencing something. That's important. It doesn't mean, you know, I'm going to give up on life. It just means, oh, I just need a moment to process, and I need someone to help me process it. ERGs actually fundamentally create that, and therefore create retention. And it's actually a lot like the softball team or the ping pong table you put in the lobby. It allows people who have a shared experience to get together, and it helps them calibrate things that are happening in their lives, right? It creates a social space. So it has to be intentional when I go to several rooms, like right now, probably the last 3 companies, I'm usually the only Black person in the room. Happens all the time. And the more senior you become, so if there's no ERG, there's nowhere for me to go, oh, I just need to talk to somebody who knows immediately what I'm experiencing. It's not like we're out to get the world and we want to jump on white people. It's just like, okay, just nice that I can talk to somebody who's experiencing the same thing I am. So ERGs can be very impactful because they're good for retention. I realize they're hard to measure their impact, but they're very helpful.
Thank you, Jason. I'm wondering if you're seeing any generational differences in this space when we have the Zillennials coming in and they're making up such a considerable percentage of our workforce now.
I've never heard this term Zillennials.
Well,
I'm
it's
learning
the
something new.
Z and the millennials, so
Oh, okay.
I didn't
Well
make it
done.
up. I
Okay,
heard it.
well
Yeah.
done. Yeah, I try to keep an open mind as a diversity professional and learn at every moment. So well done with that. Honestly, I don't see much difference. And I know most people don't think that, but if you think about Colin Kaepernick, I saw it regardless of what age. People are just like, aren't we done with this? Whether they're young or older or more mature, whatever word we want to use. What I find is generally it's the same fundamental problem, that people are on different continuums regardless of age or race and their understanding, but generally they never had a chance to practice the concept. So you have some people who, because of their major in college or whatever, are very understanding of different issues of race, but that doesn't mean I understand gender. Doesn't mean I understand anything about ability. Doesn't mean I understand anything about LGBTQ, nor those intersections of being a Black lesbian. Like, I know nothing about that, right? And so that's why I think it's more complicated, and we need to give people more space to practice and understand other people's experience.
I have a question around goals. So for our company this year, we had a goal around diversity, and next year we've actually withdrew it from our goals because our amazing DEI team said, no, this needs to be included everywhere. We don't have a single person who's accountable. Can you talk to how you hold executive or whatever level should be accountable for diversity, particularly when we hold it kind of
What I have done
proportional?
is basically every single leader has an equity table. We hold them accountable, and I'll literally, let's see, right there. We use a version of this, and this is how we hold them accountable. Who's being hired? Who's being promoted? And the small startup I have, Cape, helps create these tables for people. I'm not trying to sell anything, just saying this is how we operationalize it. And this is what I would hold every leader accountable to. And literally, that's why I sit down with anybody director above or has at least 100 or 200 reports. This is what we start showing them is, okay, you actually made 20 hires. And we've had situations where we've had leaders, you made 20 hires and hired one woman. That's not possible. Like that outcome is something else is going on, but now they know exactly what they need to do. Instead of them trying to boil the ocean, they go, okay, I need to focus on hiring, and do I have equity in my hiring process? Now the manager knows. They're not boiling out the ocean. I don't have to understand every diversity concept, but I know at the end of the day, hiring, promotion, turnovers, that seems fair. And we've gotten tons of buy-in from that because people are like, oh, this actually seems fair. I know what I'm supposed to do. We found that recruiters like it. So the HR department's like, well, I know what I'm held accountable to. I got to make sure I got diversity in my pool. So I can present the fact we're not diverse actually isn't an HR problem. It's a hiring manager problem. So we put the responsibility where it should be, and each of us know what are we supposed to do. And I've had very, very good response to this actually. And we do it actually by leader. So.
Thank you for all of your insights and your comments today. I wanted to follow up with one of the questions earlier, kind of about the challenges with some of our younger generations. And one thing that we've been challenging ourselves to find is, or to kind of switch our thinking on that line, is about finding opportunities to be able to kind of work with the strengths of that generation, and to, like one thing is that we've been, that we talk about is people coming into the workforce are thinking a lot differently about the challenges of the current, about currently joining the workforce versus when we as leaders join the workforce, and we often make assumptions about that.
Yep.
And so if we can switch and look at what some of those opportunities are, we often solve some of those issues.
Yeah, a lot of good points there. And here's what I always try to remind people is that, especially now, because we're working more remote, and we have a lot of people coming into the place, things that used to be implicit need to be explicit. Because it used to be, guess what? We would pass each other in the hallway and I might share some things with you and you would learn from that. Where now we got to be more intentional, because there's like every single meeting I have today where I currently work is on purpose. There are no accidental meetings. Like I just sit at my home and my office, and every meeting is on purpose. There's no accidental meetings. And so a lot of that knowledge that used to be transferred isn't being transferred. And so I think this younger generation actually isn't different. Like a lot of times people, oh, they just want to go right to CEO. And I was like, well, we call that ambition, right? Depending on who says it. So there's a bias that I have when I look at this younger generation. But the miss, I think many times, is they're clumsy because a lot of the water cooler talk and things like that never happen. And so we need to make things more explicit and create more spaces where, like, for instance, a networking is more important, because guess what? Once a quarter, you probably should have sessions where, and it shouldn't rotate. It should be the same core group of like 20 people who meet with the VP 4 times a year, right? And then through that, not only do they get to interact with the VP, but they get interact with other people who start helping them create this network. Because otherwise you would never get that network. You wouldn't randomly pass people in the hallway. So that information doesn't get transferred that used to be culturally transferred. It was implicit. It has to be explicit now. And I think that's the biggest challenge for this youngest generation that's now entering the workplace.
Are there other questions in the room? Any other questions coming through online? Just checking in. All right. Any other hands? Can I ask one more question about following up on the ERG question? Because I think a lot of what you said resonates with what I'm seeing at my own company, where ERGs are almost becoming a support network, or support group, affinity groups, but really focused inward. Yeah. Have you seen examples where those groups then actually get past this barrier of then influencing outward into the organization, as opposed to what I actually often see as leaders oh, good, they're taking care of each other. We're doing it. But those groups don't have the voice that in many cases they were intended, right, to have by being created.
Yeah, so we've done a couple things. Like all of our benefits are actually more inclusive because our LGBTQ, our pride group, was just literally went through the list, called out everything. These things are, and then what we did is coordinated meetings between our benefits and the LGBTQ pride group, right? And so what we've done is realized, but there is a line here. Our Latinx group is typically always tasked with doing translations. And I was like, no, you should pay for translations. They're not here to give you free work. But if you want someone to give some opinion about what's being advertised and how we message, that would be the appropriate way to start integrating how our ERGs basically grow the organization and create a voice for, you know, how this might be received by the community. So that's, we're trying to be more intentional about that, talk about our benefits. We actually have a parent group. Same thing. They went through, oh, you know, even some of the words weren't equitable. So we try to formally do more of those kind of things. And that's how we've tried to overcome that.
Great. We'll just pause for one last check-in. Any other questions? Yes.
In the environmental sphere, we're seeing a lot more kind of standardization of goals with the general like outcomes of net zero and these certain percentage reductions. Are you seeing any kind of trends with social goals, or is it such a complicated thing and such a different thing per business that it kind of drives itself to that?
Well, I tried to address it, and that's partly here. And I don't want to, like, it sounds like Jason's self-absorbed, so I apologize in advance. But the goal here was try to address some of that so it would be somewhat uniquely tailored. So the IT department, their metrics are specifically tied to IT and professionals in IT. If it's marketing, the same thing. So we try to uniquely tailor that. I hope I'm answering your question.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. Are you have you seen anything where like social pressures can sometimes overcomplicate that, and with those large standards that they're trying to set, does that come, do you think, from social pressures? Or
Yeah, that's well said. See, because I think, for instance, I mean, even the title of my session was like, everybody knew George Floyd, we have to do something. And everybody made these huge pledges that now 2 years later, they can't execute on because they were disconnected to reality. And so what I've tried to do is, okay, let's stop boiling the ocean. Let's say specifically, what can each of us do individually? Oh, there's one last thing I always say in every presentation. Now, this is one thing, pay and equity. Like women have been historically underpaid, right? There is something each of us could do. Generally, when you make a hire, there's a pay band, right? They tell you, oh, you can pay between, I don't know, 60 and 80. And I would say, well, if it's a woman, person of color, always pay at 80, pay at the top. And if each of us did that systematically, it would actually it would close that pay gap. If we all wait and say we have no agency, we'll continue to have the problem we have right now. But actually, when you're presented with that opportunity, you should actually be advocating for, because we know women only apply for jobs in which they're 100% qualified for the criteria. So actually, I'm not violating anything by paying them the highest because it makes sense. And if each of us did that systematically, it would actually close the pay gap. And so I encourage people, if presented with the opportunity, that is something you can do individually to make change.
We do have another question.
First off, thank you for your presentation and love all the sports comparisons there. Question, so we work with a number of different clients, and some of them have significant M&A activity, which means that at any given time, there could be a new culture, a new population coming into the fray. They have to be brought in a way that that value system of the company that is basically acquiring that organization, that value system has to be in alignment. And I'm wondering, from your expertise and insights, how companies can kind of navigate that type of situation. And are there certain types of strategies or approaches that are very effective in that type of situation?
Yeah, it's clumsy, but I think there's some principles I think you should have. One is, I like these slogans like, we're endeavoring to be most inclusive university. So if we were to hire another, merge with another organization, hopefully people could, oh, that makes sense. I can start understanding the culture. That's why I try to base our diversity work on organizational change, because the principles will help us incorporate another culture, because we can say, these are our tenets, or this is how we do diversity on a regular basis. But it is complicated. But I think if you just have the right principles, like, oh, this is how we hold every leader accountable to diversity, regardless of the culture, you go, okay, I got to watch who gets terminated, who gets promoted, and who gets hired. I can understand that, right? So hopefully, the principles will be the same and hopefully help people incorporate different cultures together.
Great. And we have time for one more if there is one.
So we've been talking a lot about a couple specific types of diversity, particularly gender and racial diversity. As we've been working to as we've been working to address some of those particular needs, and within those areas, there's been question within there's been questions particularly within the industry that I work in with it, which is architecture, and there's been question about what are the next terms of diversity that we should be thinking about, and we have some internal thoughts, but I was curious about your insights too.
Yeah, I intend to be overly practical and intentional. Race and gender, just because it makes sense. People with disabilities makes sense, and those are broad and complicated, especially because I have a disability myself, right? My disability is invisible. So I have a huge appreciation for it, but I also understand it's complicated for people to know how that would impact me and how it impacts the workplace. Like we have a session in our meetings where they use the first 20 minutes to read. I can't do that. And so they sit around and look at each other, but I got to read 3-4 days in advance. There's no way I could do that in the moment. And it's hard for me to have to advocate for that, but because they've been doing it for 15 years for Jason to come in and do that. So, and this is why I think the principles, if you think about it, microaggression, privilege, bias are irrelevant. You can apply that to any form of disability, any form of diversity. So if we can teach those principles, and that's why I try to focus on them, the goal is then to allow that person to begin to apply that in more different places. So that's why I think the fundamentals have to be there, because it allows you to be more broad with diversity.
Great. And with that, we will bring it to a close. Jason, thanks so much for being here.
It was fun.
I know you've left me personally with a lot to think about. I'm sure the rest of us would agree, and a lot of work that we can all do, and some real practical steps, which I think in this work we often are searching for. So thanks again. The next session is our final closing keynote and closing remarks from some of our sponsors. That starts at 45 past the hour. So a little bit of a break to continue maybe chatting, sharing some of the thoughts and takeaways you had from this session. But thanks again for being here. Together, this is a really strong community to do this work, and look forward to continuing the conversations that have begun today. So thanks again.